Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. I'm delighted that the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies is co-hosting this event with the Center for Israel Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. This event is also co-sponsored by the UCLA Department of Political Science, the UCLA Department of History, and the Berkel Center for International Relations at UCLA. Professor Michael Brenner, the director of American University's Center for Israel Studies, and I have assembled a young panel of historians to reflect on the vote taken exactly 75 years ago today in favor of UN Resolution 181, calling for the partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states. That momentous UN vote in November 1947 to partition Palestine immediately led to a civil war in Palestine and eventually resulted in the establishment of the State of Israel in May 1948. The Arab state that the resolution called for has, of course, still not been established 75 years later. Indeed, the partition of historic Palestine looks less likely today than at probably any point over the past 7 decades. To discuss the background to this vote, its consequences and historic significance, we have a panel of outstanding scholars it's my pleasure to introduce. Maha Nassar is an associate professor in the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Arizona, where she specializes in the cultural and intellectual history of the modern Arab world. She holds a PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. She is the author of the award-winning book, Brothers Apart, Palestinian Citizens of Israel and the Arab World. It was published by Stanford University Press in 2017. Her current book project is a global history of Palestine's people from Roman times to the present. Avinoam Patt is the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. Until July 2019, he served as the Philip D. Feltman Professor of Modern Jewish History at the Morris Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford. He's the author and editor of numerous books, including Finding Home and Homeland, Jewish Youth and Zionism in the Aftermath of the Holocaust, a collected volume on Jewish displaced persons titled We Are Here, New Approaches to the Study of Jewish Displaced Persons in Post-War Germany, and most recently, a book on the early post-war memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising titled The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, The Afterlife of the Revolt. Professor Patt is also director of the In Our Own Words interview project, a new archive of oral histories recorded with the grandchildren and children of Holocaust survivors. Penny Sinanoglou is an associate professor of history at Wake Forest University and visiting associate professor at Pomona College. She is the author of the award-winning book, Partitioning Palestine, British Policymaking at the End of the Empire, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2019. She's currently writing a legal history of marriage in the 19th and 20th century British Empire. And Professor Michael Brenner will moderate the panel discussion. He's a distinguished professor of history and holds the Seymour and Lillian Abelson Chair in Israel Studies at the American University, where he also serves as the director of the Center for Israel Studies. He also holds the chair of Jewish History and Culture at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, and is also the international president of the Leo Baeck Institute for the Study of German Jewish History. He's the author of numerous books, his latest, In Hitler's Munich, Jews, the Revolution and the Rise of Nazism, published this year by Princeton University Press, and In Search of Israel, The History of an Idea, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2018. And now we'll start with a short video before we get the panel discussion underway.
At Flushing, Long Island, the General Assembly of the United Nations has made its decision on Palestine. The map shows what partition means. The Jewish state colored light, the Arab state dark, Jaffa to go to the Arabs, Jerusalem internationalized. There was heated debate in the Assembly. This is the delegate from Saudi Arabia arguing against partition. Then Senor Arana of Brazil, presiding, calls on the nations to vote and announces how they vote.
Saudi Arabia? No. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes?
The resolution of the Dutch Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
And this was the scene next day in Jerusalem. The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision. If they hadn't got all they wanted, they had at least gained the verdict for the setting up of a new Jewish state, and their rejoicing was obviously a spontaneous affair. Such was the immediate Jewish reaction in Jerusalem, and it was the same in Tel Aviv and elsewhere. The Arab reaction was to follow. 2 days later, this was the typical scene. Arabs advancing on the center of Jerusalem at the beginning of a 3-day strike and an orgy of wrecking, looting and bloodshed. Isolated police were more or less powerless to deal with the riot, which beginning as a demonstration quickly led to the burning of Jewish shops and the general destruction of Jewish property. During this time, fighting between Arabs and Jews was a commonplace occurrence, and there were many casualties on both sides through stabbing and shooting. And arrests were made on both sides. Here are some Jews being taken into custody after a rooftop chase. Grenades and revolvers were freely used by the rioters. Fires were soon blazing in many places throughout Jerusalem. The burning of the wrecked cinema is typical. The implementing of the United Nations decision is the big query. Meanwhile, Britain announces the ending of her mandate next May.
Hello, everyone. On this historic day, we will discuss the historical background and also the implications of this UN vote. And you just saw a historical document. And I would like to ask our panel to tell us a little bit more about the historical background, the setting in which this UN vote took place. And I would like to start maybe with Avinoam Patt, who can tell us a little bit about the situation of Jews in the post-war world.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Michael and Dov, and thank you to your institutions for organizing the program and for the invitation. I'm glad to be part of this panel, and I look forward to hearing what my fellow panelists have to say in this discussion. So I'll try to respond to your first question. I'll keep it brief, and then I look forward to discussing with my fellow panelists. The context, as you allude to, the context of November 29th, 1947 is incredibly important. And a lot of my work has focused broadly on sort of looking at the situation in post-war Europe and trying to understand, in a broad sense, the relationship between the aftermath of the Holocaust and the decisions that led to diplomatic support, first for the partition of Palestine and then ultimately for the creation of the State of Israel. And so I'll just say, and perhaps we can discuss this further, that in many ways, for the Jewish settlement in Palestine, the Yishuv, the sort of state in the making that existed under the British mandate, in many ways, the situation in 1945 seemed quite discouraging in terms of their hopes for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. That is, that they were demographically facing demographic obstacles in terms of the size of the Jewish population in Palestine, outnumbered roughly 2 to 1. The British White Paper policy, which had been put into place in 1939 and restricted migration, also seemed to be a daunting obstacle. And then the destruction of European Jewry, where there was sort of this hoped for arrival of a large mass of Jewish population that would eventually constitute that future Jewish state, had been destroyed during the Holocaust. So in many ways, in 1945, it seemed quite unlikely that this would come to pass. And so then we have to understand what are the factors that led to the eventual, what we're commemorating today, the discussion of the partition plan and the vote in November 29th at the United Nations. And I think to understand that, I'll just sort of focus on the situation of the displaced persons in post-war Europe, because that's where we can see the United States in particular playing a more active role in post-war diplomacy and post-Holocaust politics, a lot of it having to do with the situation of what to do with the stateless refugees, the Jewish displaced persons who were displaced by the war, had essentially no home to return to or unable to return to their home due to fear of continuing violence, and many of whom eventually found their way to the American partition zone of post-war Germany. And just in brief, in the aftermath of the war, this is the summer of 1945, American authorities began to receive reports of the terrible conditions that Jews still continue to find themselves in hastily erected DP camps and refugee camps, those who have been liberated from concentration camps by the Allies. And so President Truman dispatches Earl Harrison to do a tour of the surviving population and see the conditions that they're in. And in his Harrison report, which comes out at the end of the summer of 1945, he summarizes that we, the Americans, are essentially treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them. They're behind barbed wire in camps. We just are not exterminating them. And so for our discussion here, what's important is that Harrison makes this suggestion, and in his Harrison report, that the best way beyond sort of allowing Jews to create their own separate camps and allowing them to govern their own affairs is to issue them 100,000 certificates for immigration to Palestine, that would solve the problem of Jewish statelessness. And we can discuss later, there weren't even 100,000 Jewish survivors in the American zone of Germany at the time, but he makes this suggestion, and this then leads to the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, which reinforces this suggestion to grant 100,000 certificates. And eventually we can see this interplay of the Zionist leadership in Palestine realizing that there is a surviving population in Europe that is quite ardently Zionist in terms of having reached this conclusion in the aftermath of the war, that the only future for the Jews collectively is in the land of Israel. And so we have this interplay of factors among the surviving population, support for Zionism and the creation of the Jewish national home, the involvement of the American authorities, the British, the problem of the situation in Palestine, which we will discuss, getting referred over the United Nations, the UN Special Committee then assessing the situation and not only studying what's happening in Palestine, but also looking at the situation of the surviving population and saying, we have to support partition in part to provide a home for this displaced population. So all these factors come together in the post-war period. I'll stop myself there and then we can continue the discussion.
And we'll jump right into the Arab world. How should we imagine the situation of the Arab world, maybe in a few words in general, but also the Palestinians in particular in the years after World War II until the UN vote? And I'm asking Maha for that.
Sure, thank you for that, Michael and Dov, for inviting me. It's great to be a part of this panel on this important day. And I'm really glad to be here, and I appreciate Avinoam's opening remarks. It's always dangerous to ask a historian to give historical context. I'm going to go a little bit further back, actually, to the aftermath, very briefly, I promise, to the aftermath of World War I, because I think that political context is actually crucial to understanding why and how Palestinians and Arabs responded the way they did to the partition plan. So after World War I and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, during 1919 with the Paris Peace Conference, there was a lot of discussion about what would happen to the former Ottoman lands. And there was a concerted effort on the part of Arab nationalists, particularly from the Levant, meaning Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, to declare an independent, unified, sovereign Arab state. And they issued a declaration of independence in Damascus in May of 1919 to that effect, saying that it would be democratic, it would be constitutional, and all minority rights would be respected. And they thought that they would have international support via Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations and British promises that we know were not to materialize. We also know that they recognized as far back as 1919 that the emerging Zionist movement in Palestine, they saw it as a direct threat to the political self-determination of the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, as particularly expressed in the Zionist slogan, "A land without a people for a people without a land." So with the formalization of British colonial rule over Palestine in 1922, getting ahead of myself there, the concerns and fears of the Arab nationalists were affirmed. The British recognized Jewish national claims over Palestine, but not Arab political claims. And the matter of Zionist land purchases in the 1920s led to thousands of Palestinian peasants being forced off their land. By the 30s, somewhere between 40 and 50% of the Arab rural population in Palestine was dispossessed from their land and part of the Arab landless class. Many of them moved to the outskirts of shanty towns and cities in Palestine looking for work and unable to find any, with unemployment rates hovering around 20% by the mid-1930s. So I bring all of this up to highlight both the material conditions on the ground that Palestinians faced, as well as their thwarted political and national ambitions. This led, as many of us know, to the revolt, 1936 to 39 revolt, that was opposed both to British colonial rule and to Zionist settlement, given that the Zionist settlement had a direct impact on their lives and livelihoods. We also know that this revolt was suppressed quite ruthlessly by the British with the help of Zionist militias in 1939. And 1939 also marked the year of World War II. So here we are. So a lot of the discussion around Palestine and Palestinian Arabs in World War II centers around the role of the Mufti and his role as a Nazi propagandist. Recent studies, though, show that most Arabs in Palestine opposed European fascism. In my own book, I call attention to leftist, secular, anti-colonial Arab intellectuals and activists who vehemently opposed the Mufti's anti-Jewish rhetoric and called for class solidarity and Arab-Jewish cooperation. As the World War II ends and the full horrors of the Holocaust become known, they're also keenly aware of the international sympathy for the plight of the displaced persons that Avinoam just explained. However, they did not feel that Palestinians should pay the price for the crimes of Europeans. And they also believed that partition, which was increasingly called for at the time, would lead to even more dispossession and displacement of Palestinians. They also believed that the British had no legal right to dispose of Palestine in contravention to the will of the majority population. And as we'll be talking about, I'm sure, very soon, they objected to the role that the UN was playing with regard to the partition. And I'm sure we'll return to those points soon. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maha. And finally, I would call on Penny to give us a little bit more of the background of the situation of the British at the time. And as we know, it was also not the only partition of a country at that time. Penny, please fill us in.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you to my co-panelists for these great, initial forays into the topic, and to Michael and Dov for organizing and having us all here. So I'm going to, I was sort of laughing when Maha said, it's dangerous to ask a historian to provide historical context, because I too thought, we need to go back. So I too am going to drag us backwards a little bit. But maybe from a slightly different sort of perspective, but overlapping a lot with what Avinoam and Maha have presented already. And that is to say that two things. I think when I look at this partition moment at the UN as a British imperial historian, I think, okay, we've been here before multiple times. And I mean that in two senses. First, that partition and partitioning has been a sort of constant in British conversations over Palestine since the late 1920s. So this is not the first emergence of the concept of partition. But also sort of more broadly in the Middle East, like if we think about how the Middle East mandates are created, the process in the post-World War I period, especially around the Treaty of Sèvres, and the division of the former Ottoman Empire into these new mandated territories is itself a form of cartographic and sort of geopolitical partitioning. There's also, I suppose, if you want to drill down a little bit into Palestine, there's what some revisionist Zionists, in fact, call the first partition of Palestine, which is the creation of Transjordan, right? And the sort of the division of that territory away from the Palestine mandate specifically. So I think, yeah, to recognize that there is a long history already by the 1930s of partitionist thinking that the British are engaging in. And in a nutshell, they're engaging in this thinking because by 1929, 1930, it's becoming clear to them that there is a brewing conflict. There are sort of fairly consistent outbreaks of violence. This shouldn't come as a surprise because the King-Crane Commission that had been sent into the Levant by Woodrow Wilson in 1919 had come back with a very clear reflection of the sentiments of the local population, that there was strong support for what they called a sort of greater Syria, some sort of unified Arab state. They also did articulate the desires of Zionists for some sort of a state in Palestine. So those fault lines are evident quite early in the process, right? By 1919, by 1920. But the British are facing more and more difficulty kind of controlling the situation in Palestine. So there are major riots and massacres in 1929. And I would say, a substantial turning point, a significant turning point is obviously what starts to unfold in Germany and in Eastern Europe by 1933. And we see a sort of a growing pressure in terms of immigration and desire for more immigration from 1933 on. And so the real sort of coming into full flowering, I suppose, of British partition plans takes off around 1935-36. And finally, the Peel Commission, this investigative commission that the British send in the middle of the 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolt, during sort of a pause in the revolt, comes back in July of 1937 and proposes a partition of Palestine. That's the first sort of formal articulation of a partition proposal. So when I look at the UN partition vote and look at that map, I see in my head all these maps that go back to the 1930s, right? And it's not just that I'm seeing that, it's that we know that huge reams of British documents, reports, surveys, statistics, maps were passed to UNSCOP, to the UN Special Committee on Palestine, by the British, that there were a few key British operatives who were the sort of connecting threads from the 1930s right through World War II and into the post-war planning for partition. So I think we have to think about partition kind of backwards. And then the other piece I would say, just really briefly, is to think about internationalization, the internationalization of the Palestine problem, right? And that this is, again, it's not like suddenly the UN shows up or suddenly things are turned over to the UN. Because Palestine is a British mandated territory under the auspices of the League of Nations, it is from its inception an international concern, right? There are conversations about Palestine happening in Geneva from the earliest days. And so in some ways, I look at this and I see the successor organization to the League, and Britain in some ways kind of throwing up its hands and turning the question back to to its origins. Turning the question over to the UN is effectively turning the question back to the successor to the League of Nations. So I think we also need to be attentive to that this has always been from the beginning an international question. I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Penny. Let's open the second round and talk a little bit about the plan, the vote, and the actual map. So I don't know if there's somebody who wants to tell us a little bit about how this partition actually would have looked like. Actually, it wasn't 2 parts, it was 3 parts. And also the struggle about, for the votes behind the scenes in the UN. It was all but clear before the vote how it would end. So I wonder who wants to fill us in a little bit about these questions. Any volunteers? Yes, Maha, please go ahead.
Go ahead.
So before we get to the vote, I just wanted to also draw our attention to the fact that there were actually 2 proposals. There was the minority report and the majority report. The majority report was the partition plan that we've all come to know and understand. But I do think it's worth drawing our attention just briefly to what was proposed as the minority report, which was a proposal for federation or a binational solution. This was always the minority report. It was, adopted both by the minority of UNSCOP, the UNSCOP representatives, but the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, set up an ad hoc committee on Palestine to hear out and assess and evaluate both the majority report of partition as well as the minority report of binationalism. And the ad hoc subcommittee on the minority proposal came out in favor of binationalism rather than partition, and gave a very thorough and what I think is a very well argued explanation, and now looking back on it, quite prescient observation about why partition wouldn't work. And it called instead for the establishment of a binational solution that would require the British to leave within a year, would establish a representative provisional government that would set up a constitutional assembly. That constitutional assembly would in turn draft a constitution based on the following principles, and I'll just sum up here briefly. That Palestine would be a unitary and sovereign state with a democratic constitution and would provide guarantees for the sanctity of and access to holy sites. It would respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of religion. It would recognize Hebrew alongside Arabic as an official language in areas where Jews are a majority. And it would safeguard, and it enumerates the ways in which rights and in which minority rights would be safeguarded. So this was the path, the alternative path that could have been taken. And so when we talk about Palestinian and Arab rejection of partition, I think it's worth bearing in mind that it wasn't just a rejection of partition, but it was a rejection in favor of an alternative that was laid out, even though that was not the path that was ultimately taken. And so from there, I think then we can, have a fuller discussion about why it was that partition was ultimately the one that was voted on.
Can you tell us why it was it became the minority plan, not the majority plan?
Well, I think Avinoam and Penny will know more about the diplomatic goings on than I do. I think, though, the fact that the United States and that Zionist activists in the United States were very vehemently in favor of partition, I think that played a key role. Truman himself had initially wanted to stay on the sideline of the debate, but he later reported in his memoirs that he was subjected to a tremendous amount of pressure and propaganda such that he had never experienced before in his tenure in the White House. There was a concerted effort to push for partition from Zionist organizations and groups and individuals who supported partition as a way to establish a Jewish state in Israel, a Jewish state in Palestine. And so I'll pause there and let the
sure. Avinoam, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, jump in.
I thought maybe I'll let Penny say something about, if you don't mind, Penny, to put you on the spot, just about the drawing of the maps, and then
Sure.
I'll because of your expertise specifically in sort of how partitioning worked and what the map might have actually looked like,
Sure.
and then I'll jump in.
We should have a map up. I have one open on my screen, but yeah, I'll just say that the actual I think there's tremendous Zionist pressure towards partition, but also I think that there's a way in which partition has become a sort of normative mode of planning. It keeps reemerging and reemerging. I mean, I'm just struck that like when the 1939 white paper seems to put an end to British partition planning, but actually when you sort of go into cabinet papers and other archival sources on the ground, it's like that partitionist thinking is still so prevalent that, for instance, land regulations that get passed in 1940 are delineated along these kind of partition lines. And by 1943, the British cabinet is engaging in what they assume will be sort of post-war planning for what's going to happen in Palestine. And the first thing they go to is partition, right? So they're working on partition plans from 1943 on, and they start to pass those plans over to the Americans, right? As the US gets more and more involved in the question of Palestine. So by the time we get to the UN map, I mean, again, I wish I could share this with you, but we have a map that has a lot of resonances with some of the Peel, the Peel partition plan, but also the later Woodhead. This is the commission that goes in after the Peel commission to actually try to delineate lines of partition. They come up with 3 plans. There's no majority, but when you look at the UN partition map, you can see the sort of residue of those British plans, in as much as it sets up a Jewish state and an Arab state. And then instead of setting up, as in all of the British plans, some sort of British mandated territory, right? It sets up, or it proposes rather, Jerusalem, an area around Jerusalem that includes Bethlehem, as what they call a corpus separatum, right? Like a separately run, internationalized zone. And, much of the way in which the states are divided, with, oh, great, somebody's got a map. So this sort of like, H or N-shaped Jewish state running along the coast, and then with that really narrow corridor, and then sort of the Galilee, that is absolutely reminiscent of the Peel maps, and of a lot of the British partition planning. And so, yeah, I would say, when you look at this plan, it's important to recognize that it is not the only option, right? That there is a binational, it's a federal system that's being proposed as the alternative, but also that this map has its sort of roots in British partition planning. I do want to highlight, if I can, just a couple of places where there's kind of significant differences, because one of the things that all of the British partition plans acknowledge and sort of build in is that there is going to need to be a transfer, what they call in sort of euphemistic terms, a transfer of populations. The Peel partition plan says, look, we can partition, but about 250,000 Arabs will need to be transferred out of the Jewish state. And it's something like 1,200 Jews will need to be transferred out of the Arab state. The Peel plan recognizes this. The Woodhead plans recognize that because the population is intermixed in certain ways on the ground, and because the demographics are the way they are, there's going to need to be, they don't come out and say it, but basically a forced population transfer, right? And again, this is, if we zoom out a little bit and think about the experiences of Britain in the period right around the end of World War I, this is not an unusual thing to propose. It's not an unusual thing to do. They actually move hundreds of thousands of Greek-speaking Turks and Turkish-speaking Greeks across borders you know, this is an international project of forced population transfer. So this is not a surprising thing to see in these partition plans, but in the UN plan, that's written out, right? The UN partition plan writes in the ability for every person to choose where they live. So it writes out of partition this forced population transfer. And I think that's quite significant. And the other piece I would say when we look at the map is to think not just about land, but also about finance. And in all cases, there's a complex system of economic union or of payments from the Jewish state to the Arab state in an attempt to sort of rectify what's seen as an economic imbalance.
Thank you, Penny. And Avinoam, maybe you can complete this round by filling us in a little bit about why the Jewish or Zionist side was not so enthusiastic about the minority plan, and also maybe about what's going on behind the scenes a little bit for the UN votes, or whatever you feel is.
Sure. Yeah, it's all this context. I mean, but what we're also seeing from this discussion is how we know how incredibly complicated this history is, but there's so many different factors that are coming into play here in terms of British mandatory policy and the competing claims on the land and the internationalization of the resolution. I mean, all these internal and external forces that we're trying to analyze here, which makes it incredibly complex. I'll just say, you know, one of the interesting things about looking at the map, and Penny and Maha both alluded to this. I mean, there is this longer history that goes back in terms of the British mandatory policy that goes to the context of the First World War and sort of making multiple promises to different groups. And then essentially we see the partition as an attempt to find a way out of that dual responsibility that the British have set up over the course of the mandate, you know. So it was interesting to me even to see sort of in the video that we watched, right, sort of the representative from Saudi Arabia who justifiably might have felt that there was some legitimate claim on the basis of promises that had been made by the British in the context of the First World War to sort of this greater Syria, as that being that land that was then carved off, just as, you know, we have the Balfour Declaration that is negotiated with the Zionist organization during the First World War. And so, you know, this, you can see sort of the attempt to create a partition, I think, as Penny writes about in the book, as a legacy of these competing claims and dual responsibility, and finding some way out of a situation that in many respects the British and the European powers have created in terms of trying to carve up the Middle East in this way. It's interesting looking at that map is that, you know, from the perspective of the Zionist movement, there is this, first of all, the legacy of the Balfour Declaration, and the sense that there is, you know, an assurance on the part of the British for support for the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. And as we know, right, this is a famous case of diplomatic ambiguity that doesn't specify what a Jewish national home means, what in Palestine means, you know, how much of Palestine, what part of Palestine, is it a state, is it a commonwealth, what is a national home, right? It's very, very vague, which does leave itself open to many different sort of interpretations. But also, you know, the under the mandate, the Jewish Agency has been working to essentially create all of the elements of a state in the making for sovereignty and self-rule. And so I think that also helps to explain why the majority plan is the plan in terms of, okay, we realize that we're not going to get sort of all of Palestine, or as I can't remember who said, but Penny, I think, alluded to sort of the revisionist Zionists to say, well, Palestine technically includes Transjordan. So we've given up on that part, but we do want to have some part of Palestine for, you know, a sovereign Jewish national home that will be there. But what's also interesting, and I think this is where we might be going next in our discussion, is looking at that map. This is the type of a map that is drawn by sort of kind of pie in the sky, utopian carving up of this is where the majority of the people live. In an ideal situation, we'll sort of draw the lines according to like more people live on this side, more people live on that side. And, you know, to the population transfer thing, I mean, the European context in the post-war period is also very important because we do have mass population transfers taking place in the post-war context in Europe as well. But there's also this sense, you know, when we saw in the video, the celebrations on the part of the Jewish side that, okay, this long-held dream that seemed impossible in 1939 and seemed impossible in 1945 has finally, you know, become a reality, but also a willingness to say, okay, we'll take that improbable map as it is to build our Jewish national home with this dream. And I think this is important too, because it also points to the conflict that is already there, with a realization that this is not what the final boundaries are going to look like. Because already, as we saw in the video that we just watched, there is, you know, what Benny Morris basically describes as a civil war in Palestine from November 29th, 1947 until essentially the British pull out, and, you know, until May of 1948. There's a civil war that's unfolding between the two sides, the Haganah, the Jewish defense organization, and paramilitary organizations, and Palestinian militias are already skirmishing in this period of time. So we often, you know, say, oh, the beginning of the night, we call it the 1948 war, or Israel's War of Independence, or the Nakba, to refer to this period of time. But May 14th is not the beginning, right? The skirmishing, the conflict already has begun in November of 1947, and there is this jockeying over position. So we're looking at those boundaries, but it's already quite clear that those boundaries are not going to be the boundaries already by November 30th, I would say, or December 1st or December 2nd.
I would say there's also been a kind of jockeying in a very different way, but in terms of land purchase and land settlement, right? And that's, I mean, I think that's the other thing I sort of see in a shadow when I look at that map, is the ways in which early partition plans are both reflective of sort of where populations are settling, and where you know, the Jewish Agency is buying up land. So they reflect those realities, but they then also kind of increase those realities, right? Because once it becomes known, okay, here's where the British are likely to draw lines, that sort of intensifies the desire for land acquisition in those areas. So that, you know, that's the other thing to think about, is like, we can think about armed conflict and sort of, you know, paramilitary or military skirmishing from 47, but you know, I think we can probably also say, in addition to that, there's been a kind of skirmishing through land purchase and, you know, British attempts at stopping land purchases in the 40s as a way to establish facts on the ground that will then shape the eventual map.
Thank you. And we all know how the vote ended. It ended, of course, in the necessary majority in favor of partition. There are many reasons why it went that way, and I don't think we can discuss all of them. There were geopolitical reasons, there were national interests of different countries. There was certainly also the historical fact, as described earlier also by Avinoam, that there were the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust and the Holocaust as a shadow. All of those things happened, and about half a year later, the State of Israel was declared. As you say, Avinoam, that was not the beginning of a war. It was the beginning of a war against a new state, but a civil war was certainly going on before. So my question to all of you, maybe we have to be a little bit briefer in our answers, is about the implications of this outcome. And I'm very lucky today to have specialists on different areas and also on different different perspectives. So what is the outcome for the Jewish population in Palestine? What's the outcome for the Palestinian Arab population? And what's maybe the outcome from the perspective of the British? So Maybe we'll start with Maha about the Palestinian Arab population.
Sure, yeah. So as we all know, the Palestinian Arabs and Arabs by and large vehemently opposed the partition for some of the reasons that we've already discussed. But I want to bring us really back to kind of on the ground for a moment, because the British, the Yishuv, are making plans for the fate of the Palestinian Arabs without really understanding the social structures and personal connections that Palestinian Arabs have to the land. And so while we talk about the Palestinians as a national formation or as a national movement, and that's all true, there's also a very specific, very localized attachment to land that I think gets overlooked in a lot of these discussions. So when a Palestinian meets another Palestinian anywhere else in the world, still today, once they each find out they're Palestinian, the next question is, what balad are you from? What town, what village, what city are you from? What's your surname? What's your family name? And connections are established in that way. So the partition plan, as we saw on the map, looks like it has that narrow strip, the N shape or H shape of the Jewish state, but the proposed borders of that Jewish state had 500,000 Palestinian Arabs living within it. And even though the partition plan itself did not call for the forced transfer of those Arabs, as Penny pointed out, the history of transfer is a history of forced displacement. The history of partition is a history of forced displacement. And so Palestinian Arabs understood that partition would mean their own displacement, their own dispossession. And other Arabs understood the same thing. And so the implications for partition were not just about the principle of partition, which they also opposed, as I mentioned earlier, but it was about the specificities of the partition and what it would mean, particularly for those 500,000 Palestinians living within the Jewish state. But then also the example of Jaffa told us and told Palestinians at the time that even areas designated as part of the Arab state or under Arab control were themselves subject to attack. So Jaffa's population of Arabs was depopulated before May 14th, in April and early May of that year. So not only were Palestinians worried about what their faith would be among those within the Jewish state, but even those in the areas designated as part of the Arab state.
Yes, and maybe Avinoam, you want to go next?
Sure, and I'll keep it brief so we can also engage with the discussion. I mean, in the Q&A, I think one of the interesting things in terms of examining this time period is, so we're talking about partition, and it's interesting to think about, again, back to that minority plan versus a majority plan, sort of creating a nation state on the different, we're talking about the Jewish state, the Arab state, but as Maha is alluding to, right, we have these different conceptions of either Palestinian national identity or sort of connections that are much more localized, either to villages, to towns, to family bonds, to sort of broader clans, that we have to be very careful about sort of projecting these kind of national categories onto a much more complex dynamic that's taking place. Versus, I mean, this helps explain a lot from the perspective of Zionism. There is a very well organized sort of strategic vision of what the state will look like, what the institutions of that future state in the making will look like. Even, as Penny was mentioning, that the land purchasing done, strategically in terms of thinking about how do you engage in a policy of contiguous land purchase that will maximize sort of security and also maximize sort of the ability to build larger settlements and larger population areas. That's done in a rather organized way, right, on the part of the Jewish Agency, the Jewish National Fund, making these land purchases. In many cases, from, as Maha alluded to, you have peasants who are living on the land who get displaced by these land purchases by deeds that are sold by, in some cases, nobles who live very, very far away, who are selling the land, right? So, all of these aspects, I think, are important. And then when we transition to looking at what happens in the war itself, I mean, I think during the war as well, you have, we've talked about sort of the demographic situation, and it used to be that the history of the War of Independence, 1948 war from the Israeli side, was written as sort of a miraculous victory of the few against the many, outnumbered 2-1, invasion of 5 armies. But when you look at sort of the history of what actually happens during the war, you have a highly, highly motivated fighting force, a large proportion of sort of military-aged men who are well-trained when it comes to fighting, a successful, arms acquisition policy, the development of an air force, versus on the first stage of the war, we're talking about sort of the Palestinian militias, which are not quite as well organized. And then when we talk about sort of the 5 invading armies, they each have different strategic goals that are not about creating a Palestinian state, right? So, they're invading for their own reasons and to acquire their own land, and they don't have a unified policy. And so I think all of those factors explain a lot in terms of also why Israel is able to successfully emerge from that war with the creation of the state, 1948 and after the war is over in 1949.
Thank you, Avinoam. And Penny, before we go to you, I would actually integrate the first question from our Q&A, which you might answer as well. And that is why Britain actually abstained in the vote. And you can, of course, add whatever else you wanted to say.
Of course. I had just seen that and I was thinking, oh, I'll integrate this into my answer. I mean, in a really straightforward way, for Britain, the partition vote is a relief, because it means a definitive, that there's a sense that, okay, somebody's taken over. Britain has unilaterally declared when it's leaving, and the fact that partition becomes the policy is quite in line with British practices going back over a decade. So in that sense, it's like it's fairly consistent for Britain. Why the UK abstains in the vote is sort of multifaceted. Number one, to maintain at least the appearance of neutrality. I mean, they continue to abstain on votes when the UN votes on admitting the new state of Israel. Like there's kind of continued British abstention as a way of disavowing, which is really fascinating, right? Sort of disavowing any position, right? Sort of maintaining, even in this like post-mandatory period, maintaining neutrality, right? We're a neutral power, so we're not going to vote one way or the other. I mean, the other reasons are slightly more complex and have to do with sort of internal British politics and Commonwealth politics. Most of the Commonwealth states voted in favor of partition. There was tremendous argument within the sort of ranks of British policymakers about whether to vote. That basically a vote for partition was seen as sort of endangering Britain's position in the Arab world. And they're at this point struggling with a situation in Egypt, so there was real desire on the part of some of the sort of foreign policy operatives to stay out of this question, because a vote for partition was seen as a sort of an anti-Arab vote, and that could have opened Britain up to riots and unrest and so on in other parts of the Arab world. So, for multiple reasons, that abstention was preferable, and Britain kind of stays in that abstentionist mode for several years. Yeah.
Thank you. And as I'm collecting more questions, we already have quite a lot, and I apologize, we cannot ask all of them in a given time, but I'll ask a few. And actually, there were quite a few about the minority plan. I think, Maha, you've found something which was probably new to a lot of people. One question I think is, of course, of importance, and that's, what about provisions for Jewish immigration in that one state binational plan?
Oh, there we go. So I'll put let me maybe now do it before I forget. I'm going to put a link to the minority. No, I won't. I'll send it to the panelists and maybe get it out to the attendees. So you can read it yourself and sort of take a look at it. So these were all recommendations that were proposed for future resolution, right? So the idea was to maintain the sovereignty and to protect the rights of those involved. And so the UN subcommittee, the ad hoc subcommittee, wasn't aimed at making a final determination on things like immigration policy. What they wanted to do was to set the basic groundwork for how to move forward, especially given that the British were leaving. And so they were proposing a constituent assembly, constitution, of course, that would guarantee the rights of all parties concerned, but without specifying the policies that they would undertake, because in effect, they were saying that these would be sovereign governments, and all sovereign governments have a right to determine their own immigration policy. So that's that question. Was there another question? Sorry.
Well, there's actually an interesting question by Rafaela Del Sarto, colleague. She asks about if there were, if I understand it correctly, if there were also supporters for the minority plan within the Yishuv, within the Jewish population in Palestine, and I start maybe with this, Maha again, if there were also any support, was there any support for the partition, for the majority plan within the Arab, both the Palestinian Arab, but also the Arab state population?
Sure. So I don't know about specific support for the minority report, but we do know that Brit Shalom organization or Brit Shalom movement within the Yishuv in Mandate Palestine did support binationalism and recognized that the will of the national identity and political self-determination of the Palestinian Arabs needed to be respected if any sort of a peaceful resolution was going to emerge. And so they would have supported the principle of binationalism, although I don't know if they made a specific public endorsement of the minority plan. In the Palestinian Arab and broader Arab world, I'm not aware of any public support for partition, precisely because, as I said a bit ago, and I'll maybe elaborate a little bit more, Palestinian Arabs and Arabs as a whole understood partition and understood the establishment of a Jewish state as being predicated upon their own dispossession from their homeland and the denial of their national peoplehood. They saw that for them, the Zionist movement was a zero-sum game. The Zionist movement was predicated on the denial of a national entity called the Arabs of Palestine, or the Palestinian Arabs, who had as much of a right to form a politically sovereign entity on their homeland. And so any compromise with that was seen as essentially acceding to their own political annihilation.
And actually, thank you. Let me just say a word about the Jewish minority, about if there were any voices in favor of a binational state on the Jewish side. Of course, Brit Shalom, which was a small group, mainly intellectual group of professors. But interestingly, and that is a little different time, it was a few years earlier, 1940, Ze'ev, or Vladimir Jabotinsky, the leader of revisionist Zionism, wrote his last book, was published posthumously under the title The Jewish War Front. And in that book, he in that book, he argued actually for a binational state. Now, his state was a different state. It was like, he thought, of course, the big Palestine, both sides of the Jordan River. But there's some interesting things in there. For example, he says, if there is a Jewish prime minister, there should be an Arab vice prime minister, and vice versa. If there is an Arab prime minister, there should be a Jewish vice prime minister. So that's quite interesting. And actually, he draws on some initial constitutional plans of the revisionists of the right-wing party. Of course, again, this was 1940. And I think the important thing here was before really the Holocaust, before he knew what was actually the real fate of European Jewry. But I think it's interesting to bring that in as well, because those binational plans were not just to be found on the left, but also on the right. Of course, that is nothing I think you would discuss today among his successors. Avinoam, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I'll just say something about, first of all, about Jabotinsky, but I'm glad that Maha brings in Brit Shalom also, because it's interesting. I mean, there's sort of like the hypothetical idea, which, Brit Shalom is sort of advocating, and like you said, it's sort of more intellectuals, some philosophers. Martin Buber is a famous sort of adherent of this group. But I think for on that side, I think in some ways the revolt, the Arab revolt of 36 to 39, dashed some of the hopes of like those possibilities, right? And then which then I think kind of sidelined that in terms of the mainstream of the labor Zionist movement, or those who were what they were pushing for, which also helps to explain why the majority report was advocated that sort of didn't see this as a realistic possibility. I think for Jabotinsky, what's interesting is that he dies in 1940, but he was talking over the course of the 1930s about this catastrophe that was unfolding, that would happen. And even in his sorry, did I freeze for a second? Even in his testimony before the Peel partition plan, when he was sort of brought before the committee and offering his testimony there, he basically was making the case that sort of the urgent catastrophe that was unfolding, that was facing Jews in Europe, meant that their needs were greater, essentially. It's really interesting to bring up the 1940, but I think I have to see it in that context of sort of this sense of impending doom and catastrophe that he foresaw, that many didn't necessarily foresee, that might have led him to say, basically we'll advocate for any type of a solution that will allow for Jewish refugees to escape from Hitler's Europe. So, and then I think the context of migration is really important in the post-war period, which we've talked about, that it is very much on the part of the UN, like UNSCOP. We haven't talked about this, but in the summer of 1947, when they are touring Palestine and they go to see the situation in Europe, I mean, the drama of the Exodus, this ship filled with Holocaust survivor refugees attempting to break the British blockade of Palestine, which is very intentionally sort of timed for this time. And the survivors are on the boat, I think, are also very aware of that they are basically sort of political props, but they want to reach Palestine and they're willing to board the ship. This all unfolds in front of the UNSCOP, and I think it plays a part in sort of the drama of seeing the British turning them back and then forcing them eventually to go back to Germany. It plays an important part in the decisions that then say we have to come up with a solution to the displaced Jews after the war. And this is the only sort of, and I think it's very important in terms of the international community's support.
Yeah, I'm actually very glad you mentioned the Exodus, because I think that played a large role for the world observing Jewish refugees being sent back to Germany, of all places. I'd like to turn to Penny and again take a question also from the audience. Professor Matthias Lehmann and also some others asked about the influence of India, Ireland, and other partitions on this particular partition.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm going to answer it, I guess, in two ways. One is to think about the fact that, this vote at the end of November in 1947 is coming on the heels of the partition of India in August, right? So, and India is, votes against the partition for a multitude of reasons, but also is one of the countries that backs the Minority Report, that authors the Minority Report. So it's it's really interesting as we're talking about the Exodus and talking about the sort of Jewish refugees and the examples that are present, and those sorts of forces. It's always struck me as fascinating that the world has seen what happens in a partition in India, right? It's just a few months earlier. It's incredibly bloody. It's well documented. It's well known at the time, and that doesn't seem to turn the tide significantly against a partition plan. The longer answer is yes. The partitions of Ireland, Palestine, and India are connected. They're connected conceptually. They're connected in practice. Some of the key British officials who develop partition plans in these places move between them. Some of the sort of colonial policies. There's a lot of sharing of colonial policies across these spaces. So yes, the partitions are connected through their sort of British imperial, like the British Empire as a nexus of ideas and practices and labor and sort of intellectual and practical work connects them. But I think it's really fascinating when we look at the temporal proximity of the partition of India and the proposed partition of Palestine at the UN, that they happen so close together, and that India, Nehru is vehemently opposed to partition, having just gone through it, right? So.
Thanks. And I think we go into our last round. And there were, of course, quite a few questions asking about more of the consequences and the situation today about partition versus a binational state. I know we're all historians, but if we look from today's perspective, maybe I would ask a twofold question, and not all of you have to answer both parts, of course, but I would say one is what actually were the long-term consequences of the adoption of this partition plan? And I'm really saying this from 75 years later. What about today? And we heard that already a little bit between the lines, but where are we today? Is partition still the way to go? Is the binational state rather the way to go? And of course, I say this also in the face of a new government being built in Israel. So maybe we'll do the reverse order, and we'll start with Penny.
Okay, so I always say to my students, historians are great at talking about the past, terrible at predicting the future, and so on talking about the present. So I'll do my best. Okay, in terms of the long range impact of this particular partition plan and partitionist thinking, I think that obviously in the immediate aftermath of this partition plan, I think what's striking to me is that we spend all this time talking about the partition plan that doesn't get put into effect. It never happens. I don't say this in a critical way, but we've just had a whole panel on something that doesn't happen. And right, I've written a whole book on something that doesn't happen. So I think, what is the significance of this thing that doesn't happen? I think the significance is that it highlights this desire to somehow, square the circle, to somehow navigate what appears to be a fairly impossible situation, right? And that, that unleashes the forces of absolutism, right? That when you put on the map this division, as Avinoam said, the Zionist side sees it as a start. It's the starting point. It's not the ending point. Nobody imagines that this is going to be the ending point of the map, because if you look at it, frankly, it's absurd. And certainly from the Palestinian Arab position, this is not even a starting point. This is a non-starter, right? So I think that, the significance of this vote is that it puts out there in the world this unrealistic idea against which then, the different sides can begin their struggle, right? In terms of today, is partition or binationalism, I think neither seems to be terribly, likely. I think, we're in a sort of protracted conflict that in some ways works for both sides, has a political utility in the larger world, and so I'm afraid I'm a total pessimist. I don't think we're going to see binationalism, and I don't think we're going to see partition either.
Thank you, Penny. We all don't know how our future predictions will be, but I think that was a very sound analysis of the present situation. Maha, would you go next?
Sure. So in terms of the long-term consequences of the call for partition, I mean, we've been witnessing them now for 75 years. It's displacement, it's Nakba, it's a 75-year-old Palestinian refugee problem that has yet to be resolved. It's 5 million stateless Palestinians whose fate still hangs in the balance. I think it ultimately shows too that partition was never a feasible option with regard to Palestine. All of the detractors, all of the critics of the partition plan, all of the dire predictions they made have more or less come into fruition. Whether binationalism would have been a better option, I don't know. I don't know, and I'm doubtful in part because I don't think that the Zionist movement was prepared to live in a political entity in Palestine that accorded equal rights and equal political recognition to the native Palestinians. I think it's also interesting to think about the role of the UN in all of this after 47. So over the course of the 50s, 60s, 70s, the UN accepted over 100 nations as part of its membership. A lot of them came from colonized lands. And many of those member states recognized in the Palestinian plight their own experiences of imperialism, colonialism, and settler colonialism. And so when we see the shift that happens, particularly in the UN General Assembly, passing resolution after resolution in support of the Palestinians from the mid-70s onwards, I think we see a shift in the international community in terms of recognizing that this isn't just a matter of clashing nationalisms, but really a matter of Palestinians fighting for freedom against colonialism. And so when we understand that that's how the international community, or at least formerly colonized member states, are seeing things, then we understand too why Palestine remains, as Penny said at the beginning, such an important international question today. And I think it's also really important to note, as I will right now, that from 1978 onwards, the UN declared November 29th of every year the International Solidarity with the Palestinian People Day. So that's where we're at right now, and people all over the world, not so much maybe in the US, but elsewhere around the world, are commemorating this day with acts of solidarity and support for Palestinians and for Palestinian liberation. And so while I would not dare as a historian to predict the future, and certainly not to propose a statist solution, I think that what all of this reminds us of 75 years later is that as long as Palestinians are not free, and as long as Palestinians continue to face various forms of oppression, this will continue to be an international problem.
Thank you, Maha. And Avinoam.
Okay. Yeah, so I think, in terms of thinking about who knows, as Penny said, we're having a hard enough time talking about what happened in the past. We can't predict the future. And I say the same, I use the same line with my students as well. But it is, if we think about the fate of the two-state solution, which we spend a lot of time talking about, and we can see, I mean, if we think about the significance of this as a model, right? So we still talk about the idea of partition in the sense of a two-state solution. We actually just recently, my colleague at the University of Connecticut, Jeremy Pressman, organized a three-part series on sort of Israel-Palestine futures, and Dov Waxman spoke on the two-state solution, and we had another scholar speak on one-state solution, another scholar talk about sort of a confederation model and sort of imagining what it might look like if we have each of those possible solutions. It does, the lasting significance is that it does present sort of an alternative to how do you come up with a solution that recognizes the claims of two different people for the same land, and sort of this, even if we see kind of a shrinking sort of Palestinian state in each subsequent iteration of it. The two-state solution, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in Israel, and obviously we have a new government that is certainly never, in its current formation, not going to advocate for a two-state solution. But there's a lot of discussion about, is the two-state solution dead? Is there even a possibility? But it was very interesting, in the run-up to the last elections in Israel, the former Prime Minister Yair Lapid went to the United Nations and said he still supports a two-state solution. And a lot of commentators were sort of surprised by that, which is interesting, and sort of said, well, what's in it for him politically? Why is he advocating for this? This must be sort of to try to get votes for the election. But it does sort of point in the direction of, and I think, we can be quite alarmed about the current direction of the government in Israel, and sort of the shape of the government that seems to be forming, but also remembering that in the last government in Israel was a very unique sort of alignment of parties from across the political spectrum, including for the first time an Arab party that was in the government. So these things can change, and I guess I'm waxing a little bit too optimistic and hopeful, but why not? And that there's still sort of a belief in a possibility, even post-Oslo, even post the failure of Oslo, and that there can be the realization of a Palestinian state that would live next to, and this might be sort of completely utopian, but this is where I think, going back to, like, we're still intrigued by the idea of the majority-minority plan, because intuitively we have this sense that if these two states were to live side by side, there would have to be some economic union between them, and that on the basis of that economic union, where two people can live side by side and flourish and have sort of great socioeconomic development, like, we hear that and we think, oh, maybe there is a model in there somewhere for some future. So I want to leave with that optimism and the possibility, because we'd like to hope that there is some sort of a model for a future that has the two states living side by side.
A new Middle East, as Shimon Peres thought, and many others in the mid-1990s, which probably was the most optimistic moment in these last 75 years. But hopefully when we meet again in 10 years and discuss the 85 years, we'll all end on a more optimistic note. I really would like to thank all of you. I think we had a very substantial discussion about the circumstances, the background of the vote, and also its consequences. We couldn't go into all the questions possible or all the questions from the audience, so I apologize to all of you who asked questions that we couldn't answer, but we said we would go for an hour and 15 minutes, which we did, and all of those who want to watch the last half hour of the World Cup, USA, Iran, or England, Wales, welcome to do so now. Thank you all, and thanks especially to my co-host Dov Waxman and UCLA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.